work on her thesis. She worked with Dr. Browning, myself, and Dr. Putlitz on a sort of a independently developed project, and she'll sort of tell you about the origins of it. But I do want to say it's been a pleasure working with Bree these last few months, year and a half-ish, since the discussion started on the project. Also want to let you know that Bree has already got 1 foot halfway out the door, right? Because she's starting her PhD program in just 2-3 weeks.
Right around the corner.
January 4th, you have to report for duty at University of Oklahoma to continue her educational development. So we wish her luck on that. But before she goes, she's going to tell us about bone density in competitive cyclists.
So again, thank you guys for coming. I know it's lunchtime, so hopefully you don't eat before. Try and keep it brief so you can get back to lunch wherever you need to go. But a little bit of what Dr. Reiser was saying, this has been a long process for me. The way this all began was actually I was sitting watching a presentation in Dr. Nelson's epidemiology class, and a class that would have nothing to do with cycling. A student got up and he discussed some information suggesting that cycling was negatively linked to bone mineral density. And then later on, a question came up, well, would you prescribe cycling for elderly clients? And he said no. And immediately for me, I kind of like waved my BS flag inside. I was like, that's not true. Cycling's great. So I started doing a lot of research, which led me to asking some questions. And then it led me to having to do more research and then ask more questions and then ask more questions. So that's where we start. If this can start. Great. Cool. Excited. All right, so here we are with questions. Today we're briefly going to go through some background information to get all of us on the same page. We're going to talk about what is the big picture, why does this matter, whether we're cyclists or not. Go into the study design, the results that we found, and then some conclusions, and end again with more questions. So with that, let's get on the same page. If you haven't done a DEXA or you've never seen a DEXA report, you're going to see BMC throughout this entire presentation. That stands for bone mineral content. That's essentially the weight of your bones in grams, okay? Once we have BMC, then we can actually measure your bone mineral density. So it's the weight of those bones and then divided by the size, or the surface area in centimeters squared. So everybody here has the bone mineral density. But we use clinical terms for the T-score and Z-score. So your T-score is your bone mineral density as compared to a 30-year-old reference person. So for me, a 30-year-old white female has a bone mineral density, a normal bone density, and then I'm either above by a standard deviation or a certain amount or below. So for instance, my bone density is 0.7. Okay, so that's a good thing. So I'm 0.7 standard deviations above a normal 30-year-old white female. The Z-score is age matched, so it would be where my bone density lies against someone who's 27 years old. Okay. And then our last two, when we have very low T and Z scores, we see clinical diagnoses of osteopenia and osteoporosis. And what this means, you can see over here, that green and above is normal. That's a good thing. So once you're -1 standard deviation below, you're going to be clinically classified as having osteopenia. Once you're 2.5 standard deviations below, you're going to be classified as having osteoporosis. A lot of the data that we're going to see today is going to be in this negative value, okay? But remember, -1 and above is still normal, so don't think negative as that. All right, a little bit of cycling definitions, just to let you guys know, we looked at cyclists that were competitive. So in the United States, we use categories. We have categories 1 through 5. In fact, there's Cat 1 cyclists in here, and there's Cat 4 cyclists in here. I think we have a few Cat 5s as well. Okay, that's okay, no big deal. The difference is that you're going to see our Cat 1s are more professional, more experienced, they're racing at a higher level. And then if I wanted to, I could go be a Cat 5 right now with my credit card and pay into USA Cycling, okay? All right, so as we go on throughout the whole presentation, I want to make sure that we understand that bone growth, bone loss is a very multifaceted issue. There's a lot going on here. I only looked at a very small piece. Physical activity and the type of loading that we do are going to be external factors that are important for bone health, same with our diet. But then we also have a lot of internal factors such as hormone balances and how those change throughout our life, signaling pathways, whether they're working properly or not, and your genes play a big role. skeletal response to age. We all think, well, maybe you don't, but I was naive when I started this process, that only old, cute little grandmas have osteoporosis. That's not necessarily true. So as we are aging, we all know we're thinking about our bones. They grow in length. That's how we get as tall as we are. I was about this height in 8th grade. But then up to about 35 years old, we're still adding mass and density to the skeleton. So around 0 to 35, we're still building. And then we want to try and maintain that mass as long as we can. Okay? About the start of the 5th decade is when we start to see losses in bone mass for both men and women. However, these do not follow the same trend. Most of you guys, when you think of women in their 50s or their 60s, we think menopause. That's a good thing to think of. Somebody let the boss in, please. You gotta make sure he's here. So in the 50s and 60s, once women go through menopause, we know that their hormone profile changes drastically, and their bone mineral density also tends to follow. For you guys, luckily, fortunately, males, your guys' hormone levels don't change as drastically, so your bone mass doesn't see the sharp decline that we see as females. When we have major issues with bone loss, it leads to disease. As we already elucidated to, the osteoporosis is that negative 2.5 standard deviations below. And this has a lot of different things that play into it. Genetics, obviously, dysfunctional signaling pathways, and then also a big factor that we're going to talk about today is the type of stimuli mechanically that you're going to put on your skeleton over your lifetime. Now, I'd like to break down into two categories. We have internal loading and external loading. When you think of internal loading, we'd like you to think of muscular forces. Okay, these are very nice. So cyclists.
Is that Dr. Miller?
Yeah, this is actually, I forgot to tell you guys, I should have put courtesy of Dr. Bin. Is that, so they can create pretty large muscle forces, especially with sprinters, climbers, for a wide variety of reasons. Whenever you have that tissue pulling on the end of the long bone with a lot of power, it's going to force that bone to respond to the force and grow. Okay, so we have internal sources of force, and then we also have external sources, and this is my favorite. Okay, so we have runners. Every time we're running, we have a heel contact with the ground. Okay, and there's a ground reaction force, vertical ground reaction force. It's going to cause a vibration through the long bones, which would also cause the bone to grow. Broncos, we're very nice. We're wonderful. We're just trying to help Tom Brady build his skeletal mass right now. That's all we're doing. We're forcing an external load. Okay, we're team players. Team players. So we want to make sure we're thinking of external sources of force and load first, and also internal sources. There's also 5 factors that are really important. We have the rate, so how quickly does that force get to the peak amount? So for instance, if I'm going to do a plyometric or jump off of a box, that force went up to its peak amount very quickly. We have the magnitude, so that's the amount of peak force that you're going to sustain. I like to think of magnitude in terms of weightlifters. Duration, how long am I actually being under that force or being exposed to that force? The frequency is how many times you're going to be exposed to that force over a given amount of time. So like steps per minute or things like that. And then rest, we'll talk a little bit at the very end, a little bit more about that. So an example here, a mogul skier. They have a very high frequency and rate, and sometimes magnitude. They're not very good. They're going to constantly be making those turns, and their lower body is going to feel a lot of force over and over and over again. We do see that they have greater BMD than controls. Same with weightlifters. Some of the largest BMDs ever recorded are from weightlifters. I mean, this guy might weigh like 180 pounds, and that could be 500 pounds. It's pretty impressive. This also, I think, is a bit of a long duration, because if he gets stuck even for a second in the bottom of that squat, that whole movement or that whole time, top to bottom, might take him 2 seconds, 3 seconds. That's a long time for such a heavy force. The frequency is important. Like we said, we could think of in runners your cadence, so your steps per minute or something like that. And then lastly, we want to talk about is rest. And this hasn't been researched that much, but to me, for me, it's common sense. Just like any other tissue in the body, if we damage it for whatever reason, okay, it's going to need time to repair. And if you don't give that tissue time to repair, you're going to see long-term decrements. So a couple of factors, especially for cyclists, is diet. Some of these guys, especially our Cat 1s, could possibly need to stay within energy balance on the bike. They might need to eat 3,500, 4,000 calories. They only have tiny little pockets, and they're riding their bikes. It's not easy to stay within energy balance on the bike. Okay, Some studies have suggested if you can stay within energy balance, your bone loss, your bone mass won't be as compromised. And then we always think, as soon as you think bones in the diet, you think vitamin D, calcium. These are very important. And these play a role together. You can't really talk about one without the other. So I'll just very briefly go through this. This is the small intestine, the GI tract. We have ingested calcium, okay? But then calcium needs a way to get through the small intestine and actually get into the blood, and that's where vitamin D is going to come in. Excuse me. Lunch. Some calcium in there, hopefully. So once we get our vitamin D helping calcium get out of the small intestine, it goes into the blood. Now, calcium in the blood is very, very, very tightly regulated. We like our homeostasis, our range is very small. So if we see, for instance, for whatever reason, there's low calcium in the blood, there's a lot of different pathways that are going to be essentially turned on, or signaling pathways. But parathyroid hormone is key, and that's going to let our system know we do not have enough plasma calcium. And then eventually it will signal osteoclasts to mobilize calcium so that we can kind of keep ourselves within homeostasis. An interesting thought, some friends, they're not my colleagues because I'm not that cool yet, some of my friends, though, down in Denver are studying this idea of sweating. Some people suggest that if you sweat enough, then you think dermal calcium loss. If you have enough of that, then our blood calcium levels will go down. Parathyroid hormone is going to have to signal the osteoclasts to actually mobilize a lot of calcium, and this could play a role in the loss of bone mass, specifically within cyclists. We didn't study that either. But, all right, so factors in the literature that we want to focus on. We talked a little bit about it's a non-weight bearing sport, but there are large muscle forces. Okay? Talked a little bit about the diet. Maybe low bone mineral density in cycling isn't necessarily a bad thing. You don't see very many 300-pound linemen who are also good on a bike. Maybe cycling is selective of smaller frames. And Dr. Browning brought up a good point the other day. If you're really looking at getting peak power, you want to maximize contractile tissue, right? We want as much muscle as we can. But we also want to be as light as we can. So once you lose as much adipose as you can possibly lose and you've maximized muscle, the next logical place to make yourself lighter or lose mass would be the bone. So maybe we're not thinking about this the right way. Maybe the low bone density found in cyclists is actually a positive adaptation at the upper levels and not necessarily an ill effect. And then we also want to make sure that we understand what role is competition level playing. That's a big question for us the whole day. We have Tour de France riders. Everybody likes to study the pros. It's more fun, right? You want to study the elite of the elite. We do see across the board that Tour de France riders do have lower bone density than our match control. So within the 3-week race alone, studies have shown that their lumbar BMD can go down 25% just within the 3 weeks. That's terrifying. We also see if you catch a Tour de France rider anytime throughout the year on average, their BMD in the lumbar region can be upwards of 10% lower than a match control. And then the femoral neck is obviously a very important site we want to look at in terms of fracture because hip fractures are very common. We see that their femoral neck can be 18% less than controls. But this is, again, at the most elite level that we can possibly think of. Then we look at master riders, and first we need to define what a master rider is. A master rider is not necessarily a Cat 1. They're not necessarily a professional rider. It means you're over the age of 35. Okay, so you might have also heard that as master lifters. Master just means an age range, okay? But a good study showed that about 2/3 of master cyclists could possibly have osteopenia. Okay, that's -1 standard deviation below. And then this is one of my favorite studies, but it does have some limitations we're going to have to talk about. Very long study, 7 years. Followed a large group of master cyclists. This took place in California at the University of San Diego. And they found at the beginning 84% had osteopenia. By the end of those 7 years, about 30% of them had osteoporosis. So if you only saw that statistic, you didn't read the study, that's not good news. Okay, so we're seeing this trend. And a lot of people only read this and then instantly said, cycling's bad for bones, we cannot prescribe it to people with low bone mass, such as elderly or bed rest patients or things like that. But I'd like to bring up some significant limitations of this study, is that because they were only classified as master level cyclists, some of them could have been professional caliber, and some of them could have been commuters. They didn't tightly control for the mileage, for the competition. They also didn't tightly control for the type of bike that they raced, or if they had bone mineral issues beforehand. So there's a lot of limitations. So we can't just see this statistic and say bone mineral density in cyclists, this is a terrible story. So what's the big picture for you cyclists? How many of you are cyclists in here? Or you at least commute? Almost half. Yeah, oh, okay, more than half. Yep. Okay, so what is the big picture for you? We do know that low bone mineral density could lead to also traumatic injury and increase your fracture risk. Hopefully, if you have good bones, you take a little spill on your bike and you end up with road rash. If you have low bone mineral density, you're just increasing your risk for that becoming a shoulder fracture, which is the most common injury among cyclists. We see here that at the pro level, 43 of 51 pros experienced a major injury that took them off the bike. Just under half of those injuries were knee fractures. The other half were classified as overuse injuries. And then something that's just in our office, I can point to about 8 of you who have either been hit by a car this semester, or have hit a car, or have wrecked on your own, okay, on a bike. So unfortunately, this does happen quite a bit. And then on a not funny note, of course, we know that this is real and that the risk is real because of what happened on Lake Street just a few days ago on our own campus. So this is a legit concern for cyclists. Without that one, sorry. Tour de France riders lost 16 of them were out by the 9th stage. But again, we want to know that this is an issue, and we want to put more research into this area. But what's the big picture if you're not a cyclist? Okay? And can we actually be making these big claims saying cycling is bad for everyone with low bone density and we shouldn't be prescribing it? My question is bone mineral density a graded response to competition level? Do we see the same statistics with Tour de France riders as we see with category 4 riders, okay, less competitive riders? And that's kind of what drove us to build our hypotheses for this study. So our first hypothesis is in a large group of competitive cyclists, and this is 1 through 4, so you remember the 1s are our most elite level riders, and our 4 are just above the 5s. So I could, like I said, let me remind you that I could go become a 5 today and not even on a bike. But 4s, they do have to be racing a little bit, so they're our least competitive riders. So in a large group of Cat 1 and 4s, we think that bone mineral density and bone mineral content would be negatively correlated with increasing age, cycling and racing experience, and poor diet. But we also think it would be positively correlated with BMI at the beginning and end of the season. And then within this group, we were fortunate enough to get a lot of cyclists. So we were able to do subcategories or sub-hypotheses. So we thought that females would have a lower bone density than males. And the USA Cat 1s, our pros, would have a lower bone mineral density than our Cat 4s. And lastly, we stratified by road only versus mixed bike racers. We thought that our participants who reported only racing road bikes would have a lower bone density than participants who reported racing road, cyclocross, mountain, a wide variety of bikes. So again, this all started for me in Epi, my very first semester here. And then it was a long process for me to find a team and to actually think that maybe this was something I could study on my own because other people in the department weren't looking at these same topics. So I had to find a team first. Thank you, both of you, and Dr. Pullitz. But I had to find a team first and really get some direction. And from about October to January, we worked on our IRB. And as soon as we got approval, we started the study. So in February, which for us was categorized as the preseason, okay, in Colorado, that's when the snow is slightly starting to melt. People are starting to get back on their trainers, they're back on the road. Okay, so our preseason, what we did is after we screened and recruited all of our subjects, we gave them health history questionnaires, and we wanted to know not only were they healthy and would this be a safe study for them, we wanted to know things like how many miles do you report racing before this point? What type of bikes do you ride? How many years experience do you have? We wanted to really make sure that we knew our participants going in. And then we did a DEXA scan downstairs. Okay, that's a whole body bone mineral density scan. Looks like a giant X-ray if you've never seen one. They're pretty cool. And then a dietary recall. So we took 4 days of diet information and analyzed that. Almost exactly 6 months later, in September, was categorized as postseason, or the end of the study, and we did another DEXA and another food log. So let's meet who we had to coax into our study so that we could actually answer the questions we wanted to. Our whole group, we ended up with 42. We started around the 50 mark, and we had to exclude some people. we had, oh man, I don't know why those aren't there. That's unfortunate. There wasn't in here, see all the numbers, but I remember most of them. The N of sex, there was 22 males, okay, and there was only 20 females, so that's a relatively similar group. Then we look at the cat. We had, I'm pretty sure, a little bit more, so like maybe 24 category 1s, okay, versus the cat 4s. And then bike was not similar. That's something that we're going to talk about a little bit later. There was 26 mixed bike racers as compared to road racers, so those numbers were not as even. We had ages 18 to 49. We wanted to chop it off right before that 5th decade. Like we said, that 5th decade is when we start to see decrements in bone mass. They were local, from Denver, Boulder, and Fort Collins, a few from Loveland. And then, as you can see here, their BMIs are very normal, almost identical. That was wonderful. Didn't bank on that. Their BMD is still within the normal range. So again, I want you guys to make sure when we see a negative number, we don't instantly think that's bad. Okay, from -1 and above is still within the normal range. Okay, they're eating well over their recommended dietary calories, which we'd expect. They're probably more active. We see though that their recommended daily amount of vitamin D is much lower. It's right under 50% of what we would expect or want them to be getting. But then they're getting adequate amounts of calcium. And then something we want to talk a little bit about is the exclusion criteria. We did have to exclude some folks for instance, some women were on medications for their thyroid. Well, as we saw earlier in the bone mineral density schematic, is that if your thyroid isn't functioning properly, you're not going to be able to function calcium or maintain calcium properly. We also had to get rid of a few women who did not have regular menstrual cycles. And we had to get rid of 2 Cat 1 mixed bike racers who had osteoporosis. So they were minus 2.5 standard deviations below. So we ran a lot of statistics. Well, of course, we cleaned up our data to start with by removing our statistical outliers. We did a t-test pre and post, Pearson's correlations for the pre-season and our change over the season, so delta. 2x2 repeated measures to look at interactions, post-hocs where they were necessary, and then we also wanted to run stepwise linear regressions to see what variables were most predictive of our main bone variables that were of interest. We did about 500 sets of stats, and then after that, this is what we found. Now this is very busy, and it's kind of busy on purpose, because I want you to notice how many variables we have here. We even looked at a lot more than this, but these are the ones that we're very interested in. So we have sex. So where you see a yellow box is marked as significance, and then if there's an M, it means they have a greater value. So males were taller. Shocking. Okay, same with body mass. They were heavier. So these are all things we would expect. Women had a greater body fat percent. Males had more lean mass, lower and upper body bone mineral content, and that's measured in grams. Okay, and then I don't know if maybe you guys just aren't very good at estimators, but you definitely overestimated the number of miles you were racing and the number of races that you would participate in. No shock here that you guys ate more and that you were getting more calcium. Okay, and again, we also stratified by cat, so cat 1s versus cat 4s. Our cat 4s were older. They had greater upper body bone mineral density, but our cat 1s, no shock here, that they had more years experience, they had more years of racing experience, and they also reported racing more races, okay? Lastly, we chopped people up by bike. The only thing that was significant here was that we found the mixed bike racers would have more years of racing experience, or more years of experience, excuse me. But you do see here that the T-score is trending, and this is where I want to bring back up those 2 males that we had to exclude. They had osteoporosis. They were mixed bike racers. Had we not excluded them, the RV made us do it. Had we not excluded them, that would probably be a significant amount. Okay. So, what was our whole group? What did we find? Our whole group, you'll see the 0, there's 0, okay, in the black, -1, that's below that value is going to be osteopenia, okay? So again, from the red line and up is normal. Here are their means for the preseason and the postseason. This is everybody combined. We actually see it doesn't statistically change, okay? Good thing. We're happy about that. We don't want bone mass to just plummet, okay? We hypothesized that negative correlations would include age, cycling, racing experience, and insufficient nutrition. We see that age is actually a positive correlate, so that was backwards. And then all these are indeed negative, but none of them reach statistical significance. Okay? Then we also thought that BMI would be a positive correlate at the start or the end of the season, and it is, but it's not statistically significant. so we kind of got it. Close. Okay, but then our sex hypothesis here, we thought that females would be lower to start and end the season, and we were completely wrong. I hate it when you have a 50-50 chance and it doesn't work out. So yeah, we found that males had a much, almost a 4-fold lower bone mineral density than females, but both groups actually increased, but this increase was not statistically significant. Our cat hypothesis, we thought the cat 1s would have lower bone density than cat 4s, again, our pros versus our less competitive. Great, that's what we saw, we're very happy with this. And again, both groups actually increased their BMD, but not statistically significant. And lastly, our bike hypothesis. We thought that road racers would have a much lower bone mineral density. And there's a lot of research that backed that up, because when you're on a road bike, most of the time you're on a road. If you're not, you're in trouble. So we have our mixed bike racers, mountain bike racers, they're going through a lot more, not trauma, but they're going through a lot more force. They're going up jumps, they're on trails, there's just a lot more force, external loads that are being put on the skeleton. So we thought that these guys would have much greater BMDs as compared to our road racers, and that's not what we found. So in summary, our whole group correlates were not fully supported.